Hello, my name is Brian Bowen, and welcome to Apologetics 101, the place where we teach you to know the facts the critics don't want you to know, to learn the facts the critics don't want you to know. Alright, today I am going to be doing something a little different. I'm not really calling it a debate review per se, as much as it is a response video to something that Bart Ehrman said in a debate. So I guess you can call it a debate review, but it's not me really evaluating the debate. It's me showing some clips from the debate, but I'm basically going to be responding to certain things that were brought up in this particular debate. Basically, I've been looking at the last two debates, or specifically two debates that I saw, not the last two, but the two specific debates that I've watched a while back on Bart Ehrman, everyone's favorite poster boy for skepticism. And I realized I have never done a video response about Bart Ehrman. I've done one about Matt Dillahunty. I did one about skeptics that responded to me. I've done a debate review that I've had with some of those skeptics. But Bart Ehrman is one that I have done a significant amount of study as far as when it comes to skeptics. He's probably one that I've studied the most about in terms of his arguments. I've even got some of his books on my shelves. I've got one of his books right here, Jesus Before the Gospels, which is something that we're going to be talking a little bit about, because today we're going to be dealing with a subject matter that I've been studying with for some time called oral. It's a subject matter concerning oral culture, oral tradition, of how information is passed on. As you know, the Gospels were not written during the lifetime of Jesus. It was written sometime later. Now, of course, obviously, when you think the Gospels are going to be written, by who, whether eyewitnesses were involved, etc., all these things may impact your thinking on this. It impacts Bart's, like it impacts mine. It's going to impact your thinking a little bit, because Bart thinks that these are not written by eyewitnesses at all. They're written by later unknown Greek speaking Christians that were in no way connected to the disciples, Aramaic speaking Jews, and that sort of thing. And he thinks that disciples were illiterate and that sort of thing. So he has certain arguments on that. We're not talking about those arguments today, but he does have certain types of arguments on that. I disagree with them wholeheartedly. I believe that at least some of the disciples, if not all, could read and write. We know Matthew was a tax collector, and he would have literacy ability. We know this from receipts and stuff from tax collectors. So we know tax collectors could not only read and write, but they could actually read and write in multiple languages as well. So that's interesting. Of course, Luke was a Gentile. He definitely would have been able to read and write in Greek. Mark's Gospel and John's Gospel were written in a very low-level Greek. He claims that all four Gospels are written in highly literate Greek, which is not true. Mark and John is not written in highly literate Greek, especially Mark's Gospel. I don't know of any writing in the ancient world that's got as poor of Greek as what we find in Mark's Gospel. It's written in a very, very low-level Greek. It's the kind of Greek that an Aramaic-speaking Jew would write if they was not raised up on Greek, if they did not learn Greek since they were, since all their lives or something, that it was something that they later learned or something. And that's the kind of Greek that Mark is written in. So obviously I would disagree with Bart Ehrman on a number of issues regarding those things, but we're not really talking about those things today. Basically, I think Bart takes the position that the Form Critics does. He thinks that the Gospels are made entirely of these stories that are floating around. I don't agree with the Form Critics. I do not believe that the Gospels are made entirely of the stories. Now, what I would say, and the way I would say it, is that the oral cultural background is the background of the New Testament. Okay? As a scholar, one of the things that I specialize in is in the background of the New Testament. It's actually the main thing that I focus on as a New Testament scholar. as I focus on the background of the New Testament. And this is the background of the New Testament, because the New Testament was written on the backdrop of this oral culture that transmitted information by word of mouth. In which case, we would expect, and this is what we see as well, that oral culture would be peppered throughout the Gospels, peppered throughout the rest of the New Testament. And that's what we see, like with the early creeds like 1 Corinthians 15, or early hymns like the Karma Christi and Philippians 2. What we see in the gospel accounts as well, like whenever they were claiming that the disciples had stole the body after the tomb came up empty, had fell asleep, and they discovered the tomb was empty, so we'll make up a false tale that disciples stole the body. And Matthew says that this is being told among the Jews even to this very day. So that indicates information that's passing along and transmitted orally. All right. So certainly we would see that peppered throughout the New Testament. So I'm not arguing against the idea that we would see oral culture peppered throughout the New Testament. What I would differ with Bart is that I don't think the Gospels are made entirely of these stories. I think that there is literary sources behind it. Now, to some degree, Bart, in one case, would admit that there's literary source, because he admit that there's Q and there's M and there's L, and he says so in this debate as well. He admits that Matthew and Luke probably used Mark as a source and that sort of thing. And he admits this in this debate as well. If you watch the full debate, I will be linking the full debate in the description box below. So if they did this, if they were but even though Bart would admit to these literary sources, he seems to think that the Gospels are composed of these stories that are floating around, which is not the case, because the writer probably likely used literary sources. The writer probably likely would have talked specifically with people that were there. This is, you gotta keep in mind, the four Gospels are written within the period of time called living memory of the event. This is not the same as a biography that's written hundreds of years later. This is written within the time frame of people who were still alive that knew the events that was being referenced. So I think that's also relevant. We're not going to really be talking too much about living memory, what scholars call living memory. We're not going to be talking too much about the Gospels as Greco-Roman biographies. I do have another video that I had posted sometime early on in this channel about ancient biographies. You can watch that if you want. I don't know if I'll be linking that in the description box or not. That's a kind of an older video. But it's not composed entirely of these stories that are floating around. And what a writer does with this source could be, in fact, different than what is happening orally, by the way. Because these are Greco-Roman biographies, they may be doing something different with their sources, regardless whether you think they're being accurate or not accurate. So what they're doing with their sources may not always reflect what's going on orally. But Bart conflates that and says whatever's happening in the Gospels must also be happening there. They do talk about gospel differences. I'll probably end up getting a little bit on those, but I will not be covering that extensively. I may do another, if I continue with this discussion about Bart Ehrman and these two debates, I may sit there and do something on that. I've been meaning to do a series for a while on alleged Bible contradictions. I don't know when that's going to happen. I've been saying it's going to happen for a while now, but I got tied up on lots of other different things, and so we'll see how that goes. But in any given case, this is what today's video is about. It is about oral cultural background of the New Testament. We're going to get into some clips from this video that Bart Ehrman has with Pete Williams on Unbelievable. And we're going to talk about oral cultures. We're going to talk. It's going to be more of a topological type video. I do plan on delving this in a lot more extensively. on oral culture, doing either a separate video or a separate video series eventually on specifically on oral culture, topologically, more of a lecture type video series. I've got these books over here that I've had in the last several videos. They're research that I've done. I got some more books right here that I'm going to be using to show you on this particular video. And I've been doing some heavy duty research involving oral culture background, memory studies, social memory, and I've been really hitting the book studying this stuff because I am working on a book right now that deals specifically with the oral culture background in the New Testament. It's called Faithfully Spoken, and it's going to be a really good book. But in the meantime, I just wanted to introduce you to what we're talking about today, and without further ado, let's dive right in there. All right. Well, well. We're back in full swing. All right. Well, that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about oral cultures. Let's dive into this. I'm going to show the first clip, and let's get into it.
Right. Tell us why you think they are then. Well, okay. So first I'll say, Peter. I'll do it first in general terms, then I'll really hit it. But in general terms, Peter mentioned a scholar of oral tradition named Bart. So there's massive research done on oral traditions and how they work by people who are interested in antiquity, people who are interested in the modern world. Very famous names, British scholars, American scholars, Milman Parry, Albert Lord, Walter Ong, Jack Goody, Jan Mencina. All of these people have written big books on them, and they all agree that when traditions get passed along orally, even in oral cultures, where you would think they'd keep everything right, because there's no way to check it because there's no writing. So you think, well, they must memorize it, and they just pass it, they don't change it. And all of these studies show that that's wrong. They do change the stories, often quite significantly. So, if the Gospels are written 40, 50 years later, at least, Peter's agreeing that Luke and Mark are not eyewitnesses. They've heard these stories. What happens to the stories? So the question is, that's what happens in every oral culture that's ever been studied. So is it true with the early Christians? And there's only one way to find out, which is to compare their stories with each other. When two authors tell us the same story, do they tell the same story or not? Or are there contradictions? Are there discrepancies?
All right. Wow. All right. He says that there's numerous studies that have been done on oral cultures, and he's right. There has been lots of different studies that have been done. He named several names. Let's look at some of the people he named. He named Jack Goody. Got his book right here. He named Bartlett. Got his book right here. He named Mencina. Got his book right here. I actually got several books by Mencina. I got a couple more I didn't show, but this is one of his main ones that he's best known for. Got Lord's. Lord's working off of Perry's work. That's why he named Perry, and he then named Lord. Lord is actually working off of Perry's initial work on the bards of Yugoslavia, the Singer of Tales right here. And this is Ong, Walter Ong, Orality and Literacy. And of course, Bart Ehrman, Jesus Before the Gospels. Now, of course, I've got a lot more books besides them. I've actually gotten a lot more works, and then I got David C. Rubin's, got Cars, I got Smalls, I got several different. I got Bailey's, Kenneth Bailey's, Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, and I got a number of them. I got a number of these studies all in here, and I've studied African cultures, I've Indonesian. I mean, just a lot of different oil cultures made up. A lot of these studies have done a lot of different work on it. There's some good work in it as well. He said, and this is actually the debate that we're looking at right now. The clips from this debate is actually the reason I started studying oil culture. Actually, started really hitting the books on the subject matter. I've often heard apologists say, that they were more concerned with the gist of the sayings, that they were recording the gist and that sort of thing. And I've often wondered that. We're going to get into that later. But I've often wondered, okay, I got these Christian apologetic sources. They're telling me this. Is this right? And because I'm one of those, I got to see for myself kind of person. So that's what I did. I went out and I looked for myself to see if that's the case. And he says they all agree, and they all agree with him. He acts like these guys are all sitting around a campfire holding hands, singing Kumaha with the Circle of Life song behind them because they're all in perfect harmony. No. They differ with each other. They even differ with each other's conclusions. I got here, he mentions during the debate, and you'll see that in one of the clips. I don't think it was this one. I think there's another one that you'll see. He mentions it. He mentioned Bartlett. And he might have mentioned it in this clip, but he mentioned Bartlett, right? Remembering Bartlett and Rubin differ on their conclusion. This one pretty negative. This one very positive. They differ. You got Bancina here, and another one named Elizabeth Tonkin. They differ with each other. In fact, Elizabeth Tonkin actually says specifically that she disagrees with Bancina. And Tonkin probably agrees very closely with Bart Ehrman. Because, like Bart Ehrman, as we're going to see in a minute, believes that the stories are changing every time they're being told. And she agrees. And she says this. And she says Bancina is wrong. So Bancina doesn't hold to a lot of the stuff that Tonkin is saying in this book. Alright. Alright. Okay. Here's another book by Bancina. Memory and Manuscript. Written by Gerhardsen. He also wrote this book. The Reliability of the Gospel Tradition. He emphatically disagrees with the form critics. Bailey disagrees with the form critics and Gerhardsen. He doesn't think it's as strict as that, but he doesn't think it's as loose as the form critics. He studied the Bedouin tribe of I think they're might be Arabian. I don't know. I think they're a Semitic tribe. It's over there in the Middle East, the Middle Eastern world, and he studied that. And they all differ with each other. They differ with each other on their conclusion. They differ with each other on the degree of flexibility. And by the way, Gerhardsen disagrees with form critics. Big time, as I already mentioned. They're not in harmony with each other. There's erratic differences. And Gerhardsen don't agree with Bart Ehrman. Or he didn't before he passed away. Bailey, before his passing, didn't agree with Bart Ehrman. He doesn't mention them. They don't agree. Rubin doesn't agree. We're going to get into a citation from Rubin here in a little bit. In a few minutes actually, we're going to be getting into a quotation from David C. Rubin, concerning the conclusion he made. He's a psychologist from Duke University, and he makes a conclusion that's very positive in favor of that. And he studied multiple cultures. And this is going to factor into this because different cultures, different oral cultures will transmit information differently. One of the criticisms on Lord's work right here, is the fact that he was studying epic poetry. There's no literature in all of the New Testament's epic poetry. The closest that would come to it is possibly like when the Psalms are cited, or when or hymns or creeds or something of that nature. But even then, it's not exactly the right, because these are designed to be performed in front of audiences and stuff. Whereas creeds and hymns are not really designed for performance purposes. Okay? We could talk about every one of them, but their conclusions do differ from one another. But we can't go to Hollywood and hotwire the DeLorean to go back in the past to see how these things were being transmitted. It's just not possible to do, and we don't have the means to be able to know exactly what it is. So none of these old culture studies are going to perfectly reflect what's going on in the first century. At best, what they're going to do is they're going to give us a kind of insider's information in how these information can be transmitted and how this information can be transmitted correctly as well. They do not differ with each other massively. I've studied old culture background. It depends on what kind of oral culture. Some of them are more lucid than others. There is such thing as what's called a controlled and uncontrolled oral cultural transmission. Uncontrolled is not what the New Testament is. It's clearly controlled, because we see that when Paul talks about distinguishing between when he's talking on marriage, right, and he makes a distinction. Because one point they said, well, should we be able to get divorced for any reason? And Paul says, not I, but the Lord, meaning this tradition goes back to Jesus. And he says, unless your wife commits fornication, then no, you can't. He said, well, what if I'm married to an unbeliever? What if I'm married to one of my spouses is an unbeliever and they want to get divorced? And then he says, not the Lord, but I. He makes a distinction between tradition that went back to Jesus versus tradition that started with him. And he says, not the Lord, but I. And he said, well, if they want to get a divorce, let them get the divorce, because they're an unbeliever. Jesus never had to deal with this because everybody was pretty much an unbeliever at the time. But now when the gospel started spreading out and everything, eventually there was a point where one spouse might be a believer while the other spouse not. And so Paul was dealing with that specifically. Now, of course, his authority, he had authority over it, apostolic authority over it, to make that proclamation. But the point is simply this: if it was true that they were just making Jesus' tradition their own, and they could do anything they want to, they could play around with it, alter it, whatever, and that was acceptable in that culture, then why does Paul make that distinction? Why does Paul say this goes back to Jesus, but this right here is me? Why does Paul make that distinction? That's very interesting. We also see elements of control oral tradition with creeds and hymns, because they're designed for purpose of memorization, such as a longer line, shorter line, longer line, shorter line. This is designed as a memory aid. In fact, we actually know that mnemonic techniques were being used at the time to aid memory. A lot of the memory studies and stuff, they sometimes will bring up mnemonic techniques, and they're positive with memory techniques, but they don't really incorporate them into memory studies very often. They do bring them up on occasion, though, but they don't really seem to, at least from what I've studied so far, they don't seem to incorporate them much into the studies. Most of the time, they're just trying to figure out what people would remember normally without the aid of any additional stuff that would aid their memory. And so that's usually what they end up trying to find out. All right. He mentioned something Bart Ehrman did about these things changing every time they're told, and they're changing massively. I'm going to read you a quote from Bart Ehrman's book, because he says something similar in his book, Jesus Before the Gospels. All right, here's what he says. He's talking about Perry and Lord's study. And this is interesting because he will be talking about the gist as well, because he will admit the gist is the same. In a minute, I'll define gist for you, but first I'm going to read what Bart writes. He says, Perry and Lord listened to and recorded Yugoslavian oral epic poetry and extensively interviewed both Yugoslavian singers and those listening to them. It's true. Reading the results of their fieldwork leaves no doubt about their findings in that oral culture, every time a story is told, it is changed. The gist remains pretty much the same, but the details get changed. Often they get changed massively. This is very similar to what he says in there. This is by Bart Ehrman, Jesus Before the Gospels, page 185. All right. Well, he says that that they get changed. This is almost kind of like the equivocation fallacy in a way, because what Bart means by change is very different than what we're meaning by change. Okay, if you're saying does the words get changed? Yes, that's true. The words are changed, and in fact that's in Lord's study. That's usually what they found, was the words get changed. In fact, the biggest category. Here's Lord's work right here. They include a section where they have these comparisons in the back of the book. I don't know if you can see that right, but there's a comparison. And you notice the biggest category is omission or addition of details. These are all, on this right here, these are versions of the same thing. And it's showing different, like there's addition and omission of information in different versions. So, that was the biggest category. That was the biggest. And they just had difference in wording. But the gist, the essence of it, as he put it, is the same. But what we call the gist is the essence of the story. It's the main broad thrust of the story, which Bart has admitted actually in his book, Jesus Before the Gospels. He admits that in his words, very broad terms, that the Gospels are accurate in that way. But he doesn't think that they're specifically accurate on the details. But changes in wording doesn't mean that they're changing the detail. But here's the thing. He moves from that. This is how Bart argues. He moves from talking about the gist, right? About the changes in wording. And he goes to saying that the details are being changed in significant ways. Well, when someone says that something's being changed significantly, I'm thinking, okay, the story's being changed in a foundational sense. Like, instead of, one gospel saying Jesus died by crucifixion, another one says he was beheaded, another one says he was eaten by wild animals, something of that nature. That's what I'm thinking when he says that. But that's not what we see in the Gospels at all. We don't see those kinds of differences. We see the essence of the story, the gist of the story remaining the same, and only the way in which it's being told or how it's being worded differing. Now, you also have to keep in mind the differences in the Gospels may not be a result at all about what's going on orally. Bart claims it. Bart thinks that that's the case, but it's not. Because what a particular writer does with his source could be quite different than what is going on orally, as I already mentioned. But they're not changing stuff in a drastic, significant way. They're not doing that. Even in the case of some of the more extreme examples of oral cultures I have, a lot of times the essence is still being preserved. It's only the wording that's changing. And you can't go for how the story is being told, the words that someone chooses to use to tell the story changing, and then go from that to saying there's significant changes. That requires evidence. And the burden of proof is on Bart to prove that. All right, I want to quote you Rubin's conclusion. All right here. This is David C. Rubin's book, Memory in Oral Tradition, The Cognitive Psychology of Epic Ballads and Counting Out Rhymes. He did a study. This is a psychologist just like Bartlett. Bartlett's a psychologist. This is a psychologist from Duke University who went out and he became an expert on memory studies. He specialized specifically in autobiographical memory, which I have a couple of his books on that as well. And then he also specialized in oral cultures in reference to memory studies. And he studied these particular 3 oral cultures, and he made a particular conclusion in back of his book. Let's see what he says. All right, this is what he said. He says, by choosing the stability of oral traditions as the phenomenon of study, and by approaching 3 genres as a cognitive psychologist, several things become clear that was not always easy to see from the perspective of scholars grounded in one tradition. The search for descriptions and explanations in terms of the postulated mechanisms of human memory proved useful. One view and set of mechanisms was applied to all 3 genres, varying only in the nature of the constraints used. The theory of serial recall for oral tradition gives a good account of the existing data, borrowing in part from the parallel distributed approach to cognition. Each genre was viewed as a unique set of multiple constraints. Each song is a selection of those constraints. Borrowing from information theory, the choices of solutions to the multiple constraints are choices made among existing alternatives. Where more freedom exists, means more flexibility. He said, where more freedom exists, there is more variety in recall. One surprise was how little choice is left in the 3 genres of oral tradition studied once all constraints are considered. Verbatim or near verbatim recall is easier if the choice of words that fits all constraints is limited. In counting out rhymes, a counting out rhyme was like any, miny, miny, mo. That's the most common counting out rhyme that most people know. That's called a counting out rhyme. In counting out rhymes, most words are tightly constrained and do not vary unless the whole line they are in is also changed. But the words that can vary do. In ballads and epic, there is less constraint and more variability, though in all genres the overall constraints are enough to prevent drift beyond local variations. That was his conclusion of studying all 3 of those. The idea was that the gist, the essence of the story remains the same, but they will change the wording over time. The wording would change, but different oral cultures were different. Ballads, for example, he said in his book, changed the wording over time, but the change was very slow. It wasn't the same. But the gist always remains the same. Even in epic poetry, the gist is always the same. The essence of the story, the thrust, the overall story itself does not change. That's very, very interesting. But Bart, he thinks that the stories are changing every time that they're told, but the story itself doesn't change. It's not that the story is changing, it's how they're telling it might change. It's the choice of words they're using to tell the story. Alright, now we're going to be doing another clip here, Marvin, the second clip. We're going to talk a little bit more about what's happening in oral cultures. Let's watch the clip.
I'd like to respond to that. For one thing, I don't think you have to do a lot of research if you're living in the year 70 to report about what happened in Palestine 40 years earlier in terms of geography and such. The reason is because, as you yourself are saying, these authors are basing their accounts on things that they've heard. The stories, everybody agrees, the stories go back to Palestine. Not all the stories probably, but let's just say all they all do. Let's say all the stories go back to Palestine. That means you have an oral tradition about what happened that includes details within the stories. This is what happens in oral traditions. It's not just unusual, it's just not the New Testament. Every oral tradition is like this. You get these little details. The fact you get the details doesn't mean that the tradition itself is right. And when you say that somebody had to do a lot of research, and if they got all the trivial stuff, they also got the big stuff, that's ignoring what we know about oral tradition. We know what happens in oral traditions, and what happens is you save little details that you get right, but you can get the entire story wrong. And so the question is, what is the evidence that the story is right? We haven't gotten to this a bit yet.
Okay.
What is the evidence that, in fact, there are problems with these stories?
Well, actually, the burden of proof is actually on Bart to prove that there's evidence that's false. It's not on me to prove that it's true. It's up to Bart to prove that it's false. All right. He says this is what happens in oral cultures, that they say the little details and then, no. Okay, that's the exact opposite. We know that the gist of it was correctly. The words changed, how things are being worded, but not the details. That's opposite. That's actually opposite. He knows that that's opposite. He said so in his book. So why is he suddenly saying, oh, well, you say little details, but you can get everything else wrong, the story wrong? No. I've studied oral cultures for some time now. I've been studying them. I'll continue to study them for some time. I got some more books that I want to buy on the subject matter as well. And going through all of these sources, that's not exactly what happens in oral culture. What happens in oral culture is that the essence of the story is being preserved. It is the wording that changes. Now, to kind of give you a little backdrop, because I just kind of did a clip there, Peter Williams was arguing that that Bart was sitting there thinking that somehow, because he sits there and mentioned, that the writers knew that they had sycamore trees in Palestine and things like that, and the geography and the names are the same and stuff like that. And he's arguing all this stuff, and Bart's point of view is that he thinks that this is irrelevant to whether or not if it's true or if the stories are true. But see, the thing is that these things are actually part of the story, so they are relevant. Because if they did not happen, or if they did get it wrong, then you can try to point to it and say that's historically inaccurate. Obviously, this is part of a case building for the historicity of the Gospels. And Bart doesn't seem to understand that. He's trying to take pieces of parts like he normally does and say, no, that's not even relevant to what we're talking about, when in reality it is. Because if they didn't get it right, then obviously that would be a problem. Say, well, I just want to know if these stories are true. Well, these stories are being composed of these specifics as well. This is part of the story. So, yes. But what I want to focus on right now is what he said, that this is what goes on in oral culture, that they get the details right, which is actually opposite of what he said in the last clip. Because he said the opposite, right? He said that they get the thrust of the story, and then they messed up on the details, right? Now he's saying they get the details right, but they messed up on the thrust of the story. Exact opposite of what we see in oral culture. They get the gist of it right, definitely. And then they differ on the wording. That doesn't mean they get the details wrong. It just means how they're choosing to word the story could differ. All right. Let's see some quotes here. I got some citations down here. Okay, let's get there. It's about oral performance, popular tradition, and hidden transcript and cue. This is that book by a guy named Richard Horsley, and this is what he says on this. He says, embedded oral forms and traditions allow people to remember astonishing amounts of material, while at the same time ensuring that the material is to some extent always fluid and adaptable. For instance, the praise poems of the Zulu Kings, collected by Trevor Cope, 1968, show both stability and partial verbatim agreement from one performance to another, but also considerable variety in the ordering and choice of the possible components to suit the occasion. The choice of material points the messenger of the performer on a particular occasion and often implies criticisms or flattery of the person being praised, relating to some extent affair by means of the reference of the tradition. To dumb that down, basically he's saying that the material has been found to be amazingly accurate, but it does change flexible in how the story is being told. What I basically already said. He said partial verbatim agreement. He said, and he said it's adaptable. And it is. They can adapt the material. They're allowed to do that. He said it's both stable and partial verbatim agreement from one performance to another. Now, verbatim, we're going to get more into this when we talk about the gist of the sayings. We're not going to get into sayings yet. That's a clip that I want to play before then. But the gist of the getting into the gist of the sayings and stuff like that, and verbatim, they did allow. There were some verbatim citations. It was rare, and all of the oral cultural studies that I've studied that talks about verbatim citation says the same thing. That if the choice of wording is shorter, then verbatim citations is possible, but only if the choice of words is shorter. And according to Craig Keener's work, Christobiography, and he said this again before, he said that verbatim citations were rare in the ancient world. So we wouldn't expect them to be word for word exact necessarily, as much as that they would try to catch the gist of what was said. Now, that means they will differ in how it's worded, definitely. And there would be some degree of flexibility that would be allowed. But they will definitely, but they can actually record something verbatim if the choice of wording is short. And so there are a few exceptions to that. There could be even some verbatim citations in the New Testament. For example, many are called but few chosen. That's an easy thing to remember. Many are called but few are chosen. That could be an easy one that could be verbatim because the choice of wording is short and easy to remember. But verbatim citations were rare. So we would expect the same thing for the New Testament, that when they cited people, it was citing people in the sense of capturing the gist of what was said. Hebrew and Greek didn't even have quotation marks. They weren't concerned with being exact with the wording as much as getting the thrust, the basic concept down of what's being stated. All right, and we're going to cover that more here in a little bit. All right, let's play another clip.
That opening question, how do we get these accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, that we typically have in our New Testament? Where do you think these essentially came from, Bart? And were they, as it were, was it a case of the winners write history, as it were? Because that's often the point that's often put across, that these are the accounts we have. Perhaps these weren't the only accounts.
Well, they certainly weren't the only accounts. So there's no controversy about that. The Gospel of Luke begins by, the author says that there were many people who before him had written an account of the things Jesus said and did, and I think he's probably right. And he says that these accounts came down from eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. And so, in other words, they're accounts based on stories that people had passed along orally before somebody wrote them down. And Luke at least is admitting that acknowledging that there were people before him and presumably before the others as well. So the ultimate answer is that the stories go back to something that happened in the life of Jesus. People told the stories for a number of years. There's nothing controversial about that. In the book of Acts, people are telling stories the whole time without writing them down. They're just telling the stories that they've heard. And so my view is a fairly standard view, which is that the stories were in circulation for many years before the gospel writers produced their accounts. Jesus and his disciples, of course, were Aramaic speakers in in Galilee, and the rural part of Galilee, and the Gospels are written in Greek. And so these are accounts that were originally passed around probably in the native language of Palestine, but then are later written, some decades later, by Greek-speaking Christians. And so ultimately they go back to oral traditions, and before the oral traditions, there were events that happened that these traditions are based on.
All right. Now, I've already dealt with some of the stuff he said about them based on Greek Christians, and I've told you his viewpoint, and I told you why it's wrong, but I'm not going to get more into that. What about Luke? He tells about Luke. He says Luke sat there and says there are many people that wrote an account. This kind of models after a little bit after the way historians would mention previous accounts that have been tried. Usually they think that these accounts are inadequate. Luke's appears to be saying these accounts are inadequate as well, the ones that were written before him. Not necessarily means that Mark's. It doesn't mean that he thinks that Mark's was inaccurate or whatnot. But Mark's probably lacked a lot of details in terms of that. And it does, because it just basically continues with the last 3.5 years of Jesus' life. And doesn't mention much about his birth and doesn't mention much about his... it doesn't mention anything about his parentage, just really not as far as... the way Matthew and Luke does. And so he wants to include more details. He wants to include more stuff to let people know about this. But Bart says jumps from that to saying that these are nothing made of these stories that are floating around, because the Acts tells stories and stuff like that. Yeah, this is an oral culture background. That's true. And that's not in conflict at all. This is an oral culture background. The New Testament is written in. And yes, they're transmitting this information orally. Again, not really disputed. But that doesn't mean that the Gospels are made entirely of oral cultural studies. Luke doesn't say he's gotten everything from what other people said. Of course, he does get things from what the people said. But he also says that he's basing it on previous accounts. He says he got it from eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses. Okay? Bart has this thing where he'll sit there and keep saying, they don't really say that they got it from eyewitnesses. I think he might even said in this debate that Luke doesn't say he actually got his information from eyewitnesses. But he does actually say he got his information from eyewitnesses. He doesn't just say, I just heard it from, in the grapevine or something. But rather, he got his information from eyewitnesses and those who are ministers of the word, meaning those who were specialized in transmitting this information out. But so there is partial, obviously, a mixture of I would call it a mixture of oral culture background as well as based on written sources. I wouldn't say that means that Luke got it completely from oral cultural sources, which is what Bart tried to argue for, which is kind of weird because he actually does acknowledge that Luke and Matthew are using the common source Q, and Matthew and Luke is also using Mark, and there's actually a source in Matthew and Luke that's M and L. They're unique to Matthew and Luke. And he acknowledges that, and he mentions this in this debate. So you have to acknowledge to some degree that there's some literary sources behind it as well. If you're willing to go as far as saying, I agree with Q, I agree with Mark, I agree with M and L, well then you have to agree that there's some kind of literary source behind this as well. Not just entirely spoken of or word of mouth. But anyway, let's get to the next clip.
It doesn't really matter. You're saying that Mark portrays Jesus as divine, and that has no bearing on what I was saying. I didn't deny that. I think that Mark does see Jesus as divine. What I'm asking is, what did Jesus himself say about himself? Now, you pointed out things like John the Baptist looking to Jesus, Jesus walking in the water, Jesus healing the blind. I mean, we could talk about each of all those, but I'm agreeing that Mark portrays Jesus as divine. My question is, did Jesus go around Palestine, Galilee, and then Judea, saying, I and the Father are one? Before Abraham was I am. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. These are sayings found in the Gospel of John, which you agree is the last of the Gospels. Those sayings are not found in Mark, which you agree is an earlier Gospel. And they're not only found not in Mark. They're not found in Luke. They're not found in Matthew. They're not from Q. They're not in any of the early sources where Jesus says these things. When you pointed out that in Mark's Gospel, people continually are asking, who is this? The answer is never, he is God. And Jesus himself never says, I am God, in Matthew, Mark, Luke.
All right. Okay. This has to do with Bart's developmental theory. Well, I've been calling it developmental theory. It's kind of like a evolutionary theory involving the Gospels, how John, by the time we get to John, Jesus is deity, that sort of thing. Now he tries to get out of the fact that Mark does have references. Mark, being the earliest of the four Gospels, do have references of Jesus being the Son of God and being portrayed as God, and he agrees that Mark is portraying him as divine. Notice he uses the word divine. He doesn't think it's full Johann deity, exactly. He thinks that Jesus is being portrayed as divine in some sense, but he's not really admitting to the full deity of Christ being portrayed there in Mark. But he does. But he is. That's why he keeps using the word divine. But he does say that it's portrayed as divine. That Mark is portrayed as divine. In order to try to get out of the fact that Mark actually does have references similar to that. But let me, before I get into this heavily, because I'm going to also talk about its references, part of the oral culture background, if this is even relevant to the oral culture background. And this is going to go a little bit more about what a particular writer does with a source versus what's going on in oral culture. But, you know, this covers like the I am sayings and other statements in John, you know, I am the Father are one and things like that. That's mentioned in John's Gospel. Now, theologically, I believe in the doctrine of inspiration. So obviously, I think that that John's interpretation of these passages are in fact inspired. But putting aside my theological belief historically, and I will deal with the I am sayings and things like that. But what Bart is basically doing is setting up, first of all, he's setting up an argument from silence. He's saying that if the Synoptic Gospels don't have it, that means, in John's Gospel, the only one that has it, that means it must not have been said. But that's completely false. That's an argument from silence. John himself, there's a passage in John toward the end of his Gospel. I often call it John's idiot clause. And I do that affectionately. I don't mean I'm calling Bart or anyone else an idiot. I just like saying that because it's like it's a reminder to people that the Gospels don't contain all information. It's not exhaustive. It's not complete. It's not intended to contain everything Jesus ever said and did. Well, John's Gospel toward the end ends like this. He said that he's aware that Jesus said and did more than what he wrote in his Gospel. But he said that if he wrote them down, he says this poetically, but he says all the books of the world would not contain it. But this is kind of a reminder that because they're writing on scrolls, they're very limited on the space. Most scrolls were written one-sided. They did come up with some scrolls later that were two-sided, but these were rare. And they don't come around until about late first century, I think. And even then, they were very, very rare. Nobody thinks the New Testament was written on these two-sided scrolls. They all think that they were written on one-sided scrolls. You can only probably contain about roughly 40,000 words on a scroll. So they're limited on spacing. They want to include a lot of other information, and so they're doing some stuff with their material, and they can't include everything. So there's a lot of omission of details and a lot of inclusion of details depending on what they're able to contain in the gospel accounts. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is what's going on in oral culture, although in oral culture there is some similarity to that where they would abbreviate accounts and they would And when they're telling a story, one might add additional details while the other might leave some details out. It doesn't mean they're trying to deceptive, but they know what they're trying to communicate to that person versus information that they might be have to include if they're trying to be very detailed about what they're saying, depending on how much time they have to talk about these things and so forth. And that's just how people tell stories normally. And so that would probably be, and we see that in oral cultures as well, and some of the studies that I've studied, and they've done this, where they omitted details. I showed you Lord's one, where one version would omit details while another version of the story would add details. Doesn't mean they're adding it falsely. It just means that one version might not have it, or the other one put it in there. But in this case, though, it's really just a question of space in the scrolls. They're very limited on how much information they can put inside of a scroll. And so as a result, of course, they're not going to be able to record everything. So what Bart's doing is he's setting up an argument from silence. Another good debate to see is one where he debates Justin Bass, and in the Q&A session, the questioner challenges Bart on this and mentions the argument from silence, and he said, well, it's hard to prove a negative. Well, yeah, it is hard to prove a negative, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible necessarily in every case. You can still prove a negative. It's just difficult to do, but that doesn't change the burden of proof. If Bart asserts it, then he has to prove it, okay? And he's asserting it, so where's his evidence for it? Where's his evidence that John's statement originated with John and missing from the gospel, or that because it's missing from the gospel, that means it must never have been said. Where's his evidence for that? Being missing from even the earliest sources doesn't mean it wasn't said. But with that said, do we think that this is verbatim, what Jesus actually said, expressed? No. John's gospel is very interpretive. It's extremely interpretive. I say that not to say that means we have to interpret John's gospel. No. What I'm saying is John himself are taking events that actually happened, things that were actually said and did, and he's interpreting them through a theological framework. Out of the four gospels, John is the most theological in terms of how he's viewed. And he does this with his material all across the board. I mean, we could point to lots and lots of examples of this. For example, when John the Baptist sees Jesus, he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God, which take away the sin of the world." Lamb of God is obvious reference back to the Passover Lamb. He's recognized, John the Baptist is recognizing Jesus as the Passover Lamb. Okay? Or when he talks about Jesus' crucifixion in John 3:16, that God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believe in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. And, so he's seeing these events, and it's not that the events are being made up to support the theological view. That sometimes people say that's completely false. That's 100% false. That's not true. Old cultures, it's not true of what John is doing here. The New Testament writers have shown that they saw the theological views in light of the historical reality of these events. We do the same thing today. Like when the 9/11 incident happened on the Twin Trade Towers, people saw that prophetically and theologically. And what does that mean? Is the end times fixing to come? We do that today as well. It doesn't mean the event didn't happen. Paul does this with the resurrection of Jesus. He talks about this in 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians. He said if the resurrection did not happen, then he says you're yet in your sins and your faith is useless. And so what he basically did was said that our theological views here, of Jesus dying for our sins and what we are having faith in Christ, he said all of this would be pointless. All of this would be a waste of your time if the historical reality of Jesus' resurrection had not happened. So it's not that they're making up stuff to support their theological beliefs. It's the fact that they see their theological beliefs rooted in the historical reality of these events. Well, John is doing something similar in his gospel. He sees these events happening, he sees Jesus saying these things, and he's interpreting what's being said, what's being stated, what's being done in light of his theological views. Now, of course, I do believe in the doctrine of inspiration, so I do believe his interpretation of this is inspired by God. I believe that God is directing it, and I think his interpretations are right. But that is my theological view. I'm putting aside my theological view, looking at this historically. Historically, I don't think that Jesus is saying this exactly verbatim. Like I said, verbatim citations were rare. And we don't even see verbatim citations that much even in the Synoptic Gospels. And John, on top of this, is interpreting this. So this is not just him recording the gist. This is him taking the gist of what's being said and done and then interpreting that in light of a theological view. So he's not making stuff up. He's rooting his theological belief in the historical reality of the events itself. Now, with that said, I do believe that Mark's gospel it does portray Jesus as divine, but not just portraying him as divine. I think he's expressed things within the gospel that clearly indicates that Jesus is saying these things or similar. For example, in the trial with Caiaphas, this is probably the most explicit in Mark's gospel. Now, there are lots of other references too. You know, the demons proclaiming him as the Son of God and things like that. But I think this right here is the most explicit because Jesus is being asked by Caiaphas. Now, this trial is usually considered reliable, even by Bart in Mark's gospel. And here's Jesus, and the high priest Caiaphas is asking him, if you are the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One, tell us plainly. And Jesus answered, I am. Now, this is interesting right here. I am. All right. He agrees that he is the one that's the Messiah and the Blessed One. But here's the thing. And then he says, I'll get where he says in a minute, but the Son of the Blessed One is what I want to focus on. This is a clear reference to the Son of God. But yet, where did Jesus anywhere in Mark's Gospel say, I am the Son of God? He doesn't. Not in explicit terms. He certainly did things to indicate it. He said similar things. The demons recognized him as God. But here he is saying, here's the point that I'm trying to make. In Mark's Gospel, even though Mark's Gospel don't record it, clearly Jesus must have talked about himself in the specific sense that I am the Son of God. Why would Caiaphas ask him that if he's the Son of the Blessed One? And then it gets even more explicit when he refers to himself as the Son of Man. He applies Daniel chapter 7 to himself. He said, and you shall see the Son of Man coming in clouds of glory, which only divine beings did, clouds of glory with his Father and his angels. What? With his Father and his angels. And he applied chapter 7, Daniel, Son of Man. Son of Man was not this humanistic form. This was a divine being coming in clouds of glory. So this isn't just Mark portraying himself that. Jesus in Mark is saying that. And Bart's asking the question, where in Mark does Jesus go around saying this stuff? He says it as his trial. In Mark chapter 14. Listen, I want to say one more thing about developmental theory. We're going to get to another clip. I think the other clip is also going to be dealing with this a little bit more. But I just want to say one more thing about the developmental theory. The developmental theory does a lot of cherry picking. Okay? It cherry picks. It doesn't consider other evidence. It never considers other evidence. It just considers what's in John's gospel, tries to argue from science, and it doesn't consider other evidence. When you don't consider, we only consider evidence that's favorable to your view, but you don't consider evidence that's not. It's called cherry picking. So it has to cherry pick. Anyone could take something out of the four gospels and set it up evolutionary. Well, he's doing this now in John's gospel. He didn't do it in the synoptic, so something must have changed somewhere. No. Because then usually what ends up happening, they ignore all these other stuff that was actually said and did that shows that he was doing those things in the synoptic gospels. But what about things that went in reverse? What do you mean, Brian? What do you mean? I mean, like miracles. There are more miracles in the synoptic gospels than there are in John. John don't have that many miracles in there, which is kind of weird because John sees miracles as a sign of his identity, but he doesn't have that many miracles in it. He don't have that many miracles. So this has gone in reverse. He should be loaded down with miracles, especially if he's seeing it as a sign to his self-identity. But you don't see that many miracles in John. So this is actually takes the evolutionary theory right in verse with the Gospels. All right, we're going to do another clip, and this is going to be a similar one than the one we just got through doing. It's going to be more on the developmental theory, and we'll get more into that. All right.
And why don't we talk about the words of Jesus, folks, because that's what it often comes down to in the end. Just in that last segment, Bart, you were saying that, hey, Peter, are you doing theology? Are you doing history? And many people, who are critical, let's say, of the historical reliability of the Gospels would say, well, this is more someone doing theology, someone kind of wanting to give Jesus a certain supernatural Son of God look, and we can't trust that this was actually the words of Jesus that are being put in his mouth and so on. Is that your view, that the Gospels in that sense are more a work of theology than history?
So I don't think I'd put it that way, because I think I know that there are critics who say that it's all just made up and it's just putting people's own theological beliefs onto Jesus, and I don't think that. I mean, I think that there's a lot of material in the Gospels that absolutely goes back to the historical Jesus. I think some of the sayings in the Gospels actually go back to the historical Jesus. So I don't think that they are just theology. I also don't think that they're just history. I think it's quite clear that the authors of the New Testament have shifted their stories in line with their theological views, and that the storytellers before them did the same thing. These stories have been passed along for 30, 40, 50 years. And one person tells it to the next, tells the next. Everybody's telling it in their own way, just as we all tell stories in our own way. And when you tell it in your own way, you put your own framing on it. And these are people who are believers in Jesus. So of course, they've got certain ideas about Jesus, and so they're framing it. And so the task of a historian is to decide which of these sayings of Jesus and which of these activities of Jesus, which of these experiences of Jesus probably actually happened, and which ones have been either modified or made up in the process of the retelling. And so I think that it isn't a simple matter of are they theology or are they history. I think they're both. And anybody who thinks that they're pure history, I think would have to bear the burden of proof.
I mean, you wrote a book called How Jesus Became God. And of course, one of the key claims of the Gospels is Jesus claiming divinity, claiming to be God, and that takes different manifestations in different Gospels. But what's your view? Is your view that anything that looks like Jesus claiming some kind of divine status is more likely an amendment of the Jesus story than an original?
So I wouldn't put it quite that simply. I mean, there are people today who claim to be God. And so I don't say they didn't say that because, some people didn't say that. People do say that. And so the issue is always, how do you know what Jesus said? When it comes to the New Testament Gospels, we of course have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And as I was saying earlier, it looks like Matthew and Luke have both used Mark. Mark is probably our earliest account. Matthew and Luke are later. Matthew and Luke appear to have used some other source that we don't have anymore for a number of their sayings of Jesus. And scholars have called the source Q, and it doesn't matter in my argument whether you think Q existed or not. But Luke does say he had earlier sources, so it's not implausible they had a source that some of Jesus' sayings. And so what scholars do when trying to figure out what Jesus really said, once they acknowledge that maybe he didn't say everything, because we know Jesus didn't say everything that's attributed to him in the early church, because we have other gospels, so everybody agrees Jesus didn't say these things. So somebody's making up stories. And the question is, and people are changing stories. And so we have absolute evidence of it. There's no question about it. So the question is whether that happens in the four gospels or not, or whether somehow they were protected from ever recording anything that Jesus actually didn't ever say. Were they protected from that? And what is striking to most scholars is that when you lay out the sources chronologically, over time, Jesus starts changing the sorts of things that he says. And so, for example, in Mark and in Q, which would be the sayings in Matthew and Luke not found in Mark, those would probably be our earliest sources. Jesus principally talks about the kingdom of God that's coming. There's a kingdom of God that's coming. You need to repent and prepare for it, because if you don't, you're going to be destroyed. If you are on the side of God, you'll enter into this kingdom, and there'll be a glorious existence. And so Jesus is preaching about the coming kingdom of God in Mark and Q. When you get to the Gospel of John, Jesus no longer preaches about the kingdom of God. He doesn't tell people to repent in preparation for the coming of the kingdom of God. He doesn't say that you'll be destroyed when the kingdom of God comes. The way he talks is different now. And rather than talking principally about God and the coming kingdom, he talks about himself, who he is. And so you get some of the most famous sayings of Jesus.
I am the way, the truth, and the life.
The way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life.
The good shepherd.
Before Abraham was, I am. I and the Father are one. You get all of these claims, many of which have a component of divine identity connected with them. He's claiming to be a divine being. That's crystal clear in the narrative of John, because whenever Jesus will say, I and the Father are one, and the Jews will pick up stones to stone him to death for committing blasphemy. You don't have those stories in the earliest Gospels. And it's striking, and you have to explain, if Jesus did go around calling himself a divine being, if that really happened, as John says it happened, and it's the major teaching of Jesus in John. If that's what happened, why isn't it in Mark or Q? Is it that they didn't think it was important to report that part of Jesus' teachings? Or a more plausible explanation for most people, for most critical scholars, a more plausible explanation is that over time, the Christians' understanding of Jesus changed, and they started seeing him as less of just a human Messiah and more as some kind of divine being over time. And as they saw him that way, they recorded his words in those ways. And so the later sayings of John are later representations of what later Christians said about Jesus, rather than what the earliest Christians. And if you think the earliest Christians said it, thought this about Jesus, why don't they record these sayings?
A lot to go on. I love it the way Bart always sits there and says the word scholar like it's universal and all scholars are agreement. Just like with his oral culture thing, that's just not the case. There are a lot of liberal scholars who might agree with Bart on the evolutionary theory. A lot of conservatives, they don't. I don't agree with Bart on his evolutionary development theory, obviously. And of course, you can always line up anything like that and cherry pick the data and that sort of thing. And of course, it's an argument from silence, obviously. That's another reason why it should be rejected. These guys are liminal spacing. And by the way, he mentioned something about did they not think it was important to put this in there? All right. There was a guy by the name of Marco Polo. And he goes and he gets permission from the emperor of the Mongolian Empire, Genghis Khan, around 1200s, to go and document things in China, which he does, and he puts it all in a work called The Travels of Marco Polo. And in this work, he does not mention the Great Wall of China, tea, chopsticks as an eating utensil, and foot binding, as well as other significant items. And this also shows why arguments of science are so flawed arguments. They're inherently flawed arguments. Does that mean that those things didn't exist? No. Does that mean that he wasn't aware of them? No. Does that mean he wasn't there or didn't see them or didn't know anything about them or, no. Does that mean he didn't think it was important? It certainly was important to the Chinese culture at the time. Many of them are still important today. Chopsticks as eating utensils. The Great Wall of China. Think about it for a second. The Great Wall of China is the only man-made structure that can be seen from space. You could be in the Russian space station, depending on what side of the world you're on, and see the Great Wall of China. You could be able to do that. These are important concepts. These are significant. This was significant to the Chinese culture, which he's documenting. So certainly they would have been significant to him. But he doesn't put it. Does that mean he didn't think it was significant? No. Does that mean he wasn't aware of them? No. Does that mean they didn't exist? No. Does that mean he never saw any of these things? No. We don't know why he put it in there. We can speculate all day long, but we won't know. But the fact of the matter is, the fact that the Synoptic Gospels don't include something doesn't mean they don't think it is important. Secondly, that these people were not concerned with they were not concerned with verbatim citations. They were not trying to word for word exact. Even in the Gospels accounts, the words of Jesus are likely not verbatim citations to begin with. Okay, that's a straw man argument because most Christians recognize that today. Most of them do. Now, there's some that do think that Jesus' words were recorded verbatim, but most of them recognize the fact that this is a basic paraphrase type citations. Now, with John's Gospel, it gets a little bit more because it's not just paraphrased, it's also interpreted. It's interpreted through a theological framework. Now, Bart mentioned something in this clip where he thinks that that these guys are framing the stuff based on their theology, but that's not the case at all. As we already seen, I've cited Paul, and the way in which they did it is that they saw that these historical events or the theological views were only relevant to these historical events. If these historical events did not happen, then the theological views would have been pointless. It would be pointless to even hold it, because these theological views are being rooted in these historical realities. Now, here's my view on the I am sayings of John and other statements like I am the Father or one. I think Jesus did say something to this effect. I don't think that they were exactly word for word what we find in the Gospel of John. I do think that he's taking the gist of what Jesus said or did, and he's interpreting it through a theological framework. He's not framing it the way Bart says he's framing it, but he is obviously interpreting these events. That is clear from John's Gospel. And I personally don't think that John will be doing something different with these citations or the I am sayings and so forth that he's not doing anywhere else throughout his Gospels. If you look at the I am sayings, they're woven in a very specific historical context. They're not like what you see in the Synoptic Gospels or even in other texts that shows oral communication like this. Usually what the writer does is they're topological. They take a set of sayings, they are a set of events, happenings that are closely related to one another in some sense, and they put them together. Like in Matthew's Gospel, we see all the kingdom parables together in like one kingdom parable after the next, and we see that, and and they put them topologically together. The Sermon on the Mount, they put the statements. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, and so forth. And those kinds of things. Those statements in the Sermon on the Mount, we see them topologically put together. In the case of the I am sayings, they're put separate from each other, and they're always in a specific historical context. Like one time when Jesus' friend Lazarus died, and he waited 4 days, and Martha, Lazarus' sister, goes up to him. This is in Gospel of John. Goes up to him and says, don't you care? Your friend dead. He does care because he weeps. The shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. He did care. But he was waiting for 4 days to show the glory of God because he was going to raise him from the dead, which he does. He raises him from the dead. Martha believes it now because she sees it with her own eyes that he did that. And Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. That's one of the I am statements. Ego eimi. I am the resurrection and the life. He that comes to me, although he be dead, shall he live. Do you believe this? And she said, yes, I believe you are the Lord and the living and the Son of God. And you got another one, like when they're talking about manna from heaven, and Jesus says, I am the true bread from heaven. In another I am statement. And again, another one when he's talking to them about the Jews elevate Abraham as their father. And he said that before Abraham was, I am, ego eimi. Clearly making himself one and the same with God. Well, so it is pretty clear. I think that Jesus did say something of this nature. He might not have said those exact words, but I think he said something or did something to indicate to John that this was Jesus portraying himself as divine and making himself one and the same with Yahweh. And he's interpreting this gist through that theological framework. All right, that's what I think is going on in John. So do we see him saying and doing things in the Synoptic Gospels that does portray himself as divine? Yes. Yes, we do. This is why this is cherry picking, because it often doesn't consider that fact. And it tries to argue from silence on top of that. On top of the cherry picking. Or at least it attempts to, or try to argue from silence. But anyone could stack something like that in some kind of subsequent order, and you can cherry pick the data all day long. But at the end of the day, like I said, what about those things that you can't do that with, like miracles, where the opposite's true? The fact of the matter is, these guys aren't. We know what happens in oral culture. The essence would stay the same. Now, Bart does mention, before I get into some citations, I've got some citations where I'm going to talk a little bit more about the gist of sayings to show it to you that based on the studies that have been done, that they do think that the gist of what's being said is being recorded. But before I do that, he mentioned we know that Jesus said and did things that he never really said, because we got all these later gospels, stuff outside the four gospels. The four gospels that we have are written within the period of time called living memory, and they're closer to the events. Okay, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John are closer to the events. Most scholars think that John was probably written by the mid-90s. I don't agree with this. I think it was earlier. I think a good case can even be made for a pre-70 date for John, possibly 8069. But that's an extreme minority position. Most scholars think that, even some conservative scholars like Mike Licona and Craig Evans believe that the Gospel of John is mid-90s. I think Bart said in this debate, when he was an evangelical fundamentalist, he said he agreed that John was written in the 90s. But I don't agree with that. I think John was written earlier. I don't care if it's a minority position or not. I'm open to the possibility John was written in the mid-90s. I just think the evidence is against it. So, but anyway, I'm not really going to talk on the authorship or Gospels. The point is, all four Gospels, everyone agrees within the first 2 generations of Jesus' lifetime, regardless. When you get to things like the Gnostic Gospels, the Infancy Gospels, and the Apocryphal Gospels, stuff like that, when you start getting to that, we're dealing with sources that are now in the 2nd century. Anywhere from 2nd century on up to the 6th century that we're dealing with. of course, the further away you get, and this is my argument, this is what I argue, and what I'm going to be arguing in my book, Faithfully Spoken, the further you get away from the eyewitness source, the closer you get to, like, the more further out you get from living memory, the more likely you're going to get with inaccurate information, distortions, legendary development. All those things will come into it, will come into play. No doubt about it. Nobody doubts that. Nobody questions that. But that's because these other gospels don't contain things that Jesus said or did, because it's far removed from the time of living memory. Some of these are really far removed. You know, some of the infancy gospels go all the way up into the 6th century. So yeah, the reason we don't think Jesus said and did those things is because those gospels are not written within the period of time what scholars call living memory. The 4 gospels, however, even by liberal datings of them, go back to living memory. They're written in 1st century, written in the first 2 generations of Jesus' lifetime. So that was the difference. That's the biggest difference out of that. All right. Now, okay, I did clip 5. Now I'm going to go to a citation. Let's do Bart Ehrman on the gist first. Or no, let's do Small and the gist, and then we'll talk about Bart Ehrman. All right. Here's by Wax Tablets of the Mind. Right here, Wax Tablets of the Mind. A guy by the name, a woman by the name Jocelyn Penny Small. She does Wax Tablets of the Mind, Cognitive Studies of Memory and Literacy in Classical Antiquity. Okay, she does a study on this, and this is what she came back with, the gist. Okay, after studying all these oral cultures, she said, thus for oral cultures, it is not the words, but the story or the gist that counts. In other words, it's the basic essence of the story, the thrust of the story, the broad, the picture, and so forth. It's not the exact words that's going to matter. It's whether the essence of the story, the gist, that counts. The idea of verbatim, word for word repetition occurs without written text only in a few rather limited situations. In other words, there's only very few verbatim citations. Like I said, all these studies agree that the less amount of words is the only way verbatim citation can be possible. Okay, she goes further, says magical phrases such as abracadabra and certain prayers depend for their effectiveness on exact wording, but again, the length is short. Next, so many more words survive to be remembered in a literate world than in an oral society because the words accumulate over the centuries. Not just the business records for today, but those for all the yesterdays. Not just the stories you were told, but those of your great-grandparents and their great-grandparents. Not just the laws you follow, but the laws your ancestors obeyed. Not just the famous speeches you heard, but the famous speeches of your founding fathers and their successors. Obviously, some people are better than others at remembering certain kinds of information, and they may become rememberancers in an oral society. They, however, are not necessarily memorizing words per se, but rather the gist of the content of whatever needed to be known. As Jocelyn Penny Small, Wax Tablets of the Mind, Cognitive Studies of Memory and Literacy in Classical Antiquity, 1997, pages 7 through 8. Now, listen to what she said. It's not the words that's the snippy part. It's the gist of the story. It's the gist of what's being said. So when Bart says, well, did he say those exact words in John's Gospel? The answer is no, he didn't. But that doesn't necessarily mean he didn't say anything like that. It doesn't mean that John's interpretation of what's being said is wrong. John is taking the gist of what's being said and he's interpreting that gist through a theological framework. Now, John is doing this with his gospel. This doesn't mean this is being done in the oral culture background. It's being done in John's gospel. This is what John is doing with his material. All right, let's look at the next quote. This one's from Bart Ehrman. This is what he says. He says, we tend to remember the gist of an expression pretty well, even if the details get messed up. Remember, this is the opposite of what he said in this debate. You may not remember correctly, despite what you think, where, when, with whom, or how you heard about the challenger. Again, it's emphasized. Explosion, or the result of the O.J. Simpson trial. Or even, this is harder to believe, but it appears to be true, the attacks of 9/11. He's probably referring to oral culture studies, memory studies that have been done of the 9/11 incident. But the 9/11 incident actually classifies as flashbulb memory, what psychologists call flashbulb memories. So you're likely to actually remember it much more hardcore. I've looked in some of these studies on the 9/11 as well, and at least the best one I could find so far that specifically targets it is one that mentioned, like, I think they were looking for 10 items, and when you look at the 10 items, they're not stuff that were very significant, very important, and if you look at their results, they're just like any other eyewitness reports. You focus on certain things more than others and stuff like that. So that's probably what he's referring to. But I would differ with him on that. But anyway, he goes further. Says, but you do remember that you heard about the events and you remember that they happened. Still, many of the broad outlines that are narrated in the gospel certainly did happen. Much of the gist is correct. That is a bold, incredible admission by Bart Ehrman. And this is from his book, Jesus Before the Gospels, pages 143 through 144. So he's saying in very broad terms, just to still man Bart's position, he's saying in very broad terms, he is thinking that the Gospels are correct in that sense. But I think what he thinks is that the specific details are wrong. But in oral culture studies, it's not necessarily the details, because the details could be part of the gist of the story in the first place. But it's the wording, it's the way in which the story is being told, how it's being told, the exact choice of words being used. Sometimes we see omission of details, sometimes we see addition of details. It is the words that differ. All right, let's do another quote. This one's going to be by a scholar named Carr. David M. Carr. In his book, Writing on the Tablets of the Heart. And this one involves, I think, repetition. He says, evidently, students not only had to memorize individual elements of standard works, but also be able to place the text that they had memorized into the correct order. Now understand something. This is one of the mnemonic techniques that they used was repetition. Repeating something over and over again. In fact, this is the way we typically learn. Tends to engrave it in our memories. And they repeated things over and over and over again. Even Josephus, he said, but for our people, talking about Jews, if anybody but ask any one of them about our laws, he will more readily tell them all that he will tell his own name. And this is consequence of our having learned them immediately as soon as ever we become sensible of anything, and of our having them as it were engraved on our souls. That's Josephus against Apion, AD 95, 2.178 in the Complete Works of Josephus, page 964. Right here. Josephus, 964. Josephus. All right. basically repetition was a big part of repeating it. And Josephus said that they knew it better than their own name. So yeah, but Josephus probably exaggerating that. He might be exaggerating, but the point that he's making is simply this: they learned from the time that he says the time that they were sensible enough to learn. In other words, the time when they were aware, when they were a small child, they're taught these things all the way up. So they would obey the law and be able to know the law, and they could read it. This was memory, in this old culture, memory was emphasized. Repetition of the of what's been said over and over and over again. Now he describes in the debate, I don't have the clips, but he described in the debate like it's a telephone game, like one person's telling this person is telling that person. But that's not how it was. This is a community affair. You got community of people, group settings. When I studied old cultures, I wanted to see how many of them was in group settings. Most of them appear to be in group settings. Not all of them, but most of them seem to be in group settings. The one that Kenneth Bailey does on the Bedouin tribe was in group settings. There's obviously a lot of the memory studies and old culture studies I've done. There's an emphasis, even when they're doing autobiographic memory. A lot of times there's an emphasis on what's called anthropologists call social memory. Social memory is different from autobiographic memory. Autobiographic memory has to do with memory of an individual, whereas social memory has to do with a group of individuals remembering information and transmitting it as a group. And it gets kind of directed, because if it tries to deviate a little bit, from other people saying it, that would be corrected by the group, and it'll be directed in a particular direction to maintain its staticness, to prevent it from going too far out. Now, there was some degree of flexibility that was allowed, but the flexibility was limited, and therefore they could not alter the story to the point where it would be a different story. Hence the reason why we see fundamental similarities within the Gospels themselves. All right. I think that's about it. I went through all the clips on that. Please leave me a comment section. Let me know what you think of the video. And we'll probably deal with some more stuff on Bart Ehrman's arguments. Maybe even continue, because there's some other stuff to get brought up in this debate, and there's some other stuff that gets brought up in another debate, and that Bart Ehrman was in with Mike Licona. I want to deal with some of those things, and so I might stay with this, or I might go in other directions. I do plan on doing a full video, or possibly series, in the eventual scheme of things, where I would talk about the of these oral cultural studies and so forth, and give you much more in-depth information. Also thinking about really doing a video series that I've been wanting to since the start of this channel. I think it was shortly after the start of this channel I wanted to do a video series on alleged contradiction of the Bible. They dealt with that a little bit in there, and thinking one of the clips they talked about differences maybe. I didn't really focus too much on the differences, because I wanted to do a separate video on alleged contradictions and some of the stuff that Bart brought up and stuff, and we'll deal with that eventually. But in any case, I don't think the differences is going to be very relevant to it, because what a writer does with this material might be different from what's actually happening in the oral cultural situation. Okay, but in any case, and stuff that he brings up, and he'll say it's a fundamental difference that just proves that they're changing things radically. But then the kind of things he brought up, the death of Judas, is always brought up by Bart. Whenever someone asks him, give him an example of fundamental differences. That's not a fundamental difference, because the account in Acts don't say he wasn't hanged. The account in Matthew that talked about his hanging doesn't say that didn't happen afterwards. In fact, they actually complement one another and make sense of one another, because if he's already dead, that would explain why his insides brought out, and how he fell forwards as well. If the rope broke or whatever, and his body hit the ground, the first thing you're going to do is fall forwards, because that's how gravity pulls people down. And if you're conscious of it, you would go backwards, not forwards. If you're not conscious of your direction, you would go forward. That's why you see people falling forward. You see people falling fake backwards. You know they're faking it. Because if you're truly unconscious, then you go forwards. You don't go backwards. And if you're consciously aware of it. If you're not consciously aware of it, then you're likely to go forwards. And so, so I don't see that as a fundamental difference. I don't even think that's even a apparent contradiction. I look at that as more complementary details. No Christian is losing sleep over it, but Bart always points to it like it's a major fundamental difference. Maybe we'll get more into that later on down the road, but clearly, oral cultural studies, I've studied it. I'm going to continue to study more. It's not exactly what Bart says. There are differences, in spite of what Bart said. Great differences. He doesn't bring up Gerhardsen. He doesn't bring up Bailey. He knows he didn't do that because he knows they don't agree with him. Bart appears to agree with the form critics and maybe immediate contrast model, looks like. I'm sort of in between Bailey and Gerhardsen in terms of flexibility, and I think there's useful information in both of those camps. But anyway, I will delve more deeper into this eventually later on down the road. Let me know in the comments what you think of the video, whether you think you want to see more stuff involving oral cultural studies, memory studies, things like that. And let me know in the comment section if that's what you want to see as well. I wouldn't mind hearing from you. I really like hearing from people. As far as my other debate, my other video series, When Skeptics Respond, I still plan on continuing making more videos on that. I just haven't got a chance to around to it. This kind of came up, and I really wanted to deal with some stuff that Bart was saying here, and I might deal with some more in the future. All right. Well, and on a positive note as well, I passed both my class. I'm through with that for right now. I have to pay that off. We're going back to school, but it was really great. So I made A in one class. My Daniel Revelation class, I made A. In my Acts class, I made a B. And so I made A and a B, which is really good. And so I'm happy about it. In any given case, I will see y'all later. And remember, we must always learn the facts the critics don't want you to know. And that's all for me now. Thank you.